Good morning. This is the court reporter.
Good morning.
Just,
We'll be getting started in just a second. Can you
just
hear
to
us?
let, just so I can hear you, but just to let you know, I can't see any name tags, so I don't know who is sitting. So if you could identify yourself before you speak, that would be very helpful.
Of course.
Thank you.
Jerry, you ready? Great. Well, I think we're ready to go. Good morning, everyone. For the record, Tyler Klimas, Executive Director of the Cannabis Compliance Board. Today is Tuesday, July 21st, 2020. The time is 9:03 a.m. We are currently here in the Gaming Control Boardroom at the Grant Sawyer Building in Las Vegas with connection to the Gaming Control Boardroom in Carson City. This is the time and place for the inaugural meeting of the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Board. Today's meeting has been properly noticed and posted in accordance with the open meeting law, with adherence and in compliance to the Governor's Emergency Directive, number 006, dated March 22nd, 2020. It looks like we have audio and video connection with Carson City. And I have confirmation that we are live online. So with your approval to begin, Chairman Douglas, I will proceed in calling roll.
Please do so. This is Chairman Douglas.
Great. Member Jerry Merritt. Here. Member Dennis Nylander.
Present.
And Chairman Michael Douglas.
Present.
Great. Deputy Bala, can you please confirm that we have complied with the open meeting requirements?
We are, sir.
Fantastic. Let's get started. So for agenda item 1 is public comment. Chair, members of the board, before we move to reading public comment, I believe it's important to note that we are in fact holding a meeting comprised of electronic communication. That is, there is no in-person public participation available. This is not by design, but rather something not only required and in compliance with Governor Sisolak's emergency directive, but also prudent in the face of this public health crisis. Certainly, there is opportunity to expand on our electronic capabilities to host meetings, especially if these necessary restrictions are to continue for some time. But for the time being and within our staffing and budget capabilities, we will continue to maintain the most transparent and robust public participation opportunities available to us. To that end, we solicited public comments for this meeting to be read at the first public comment period. This solicitation was clearly noted on our agenda and was open to the public until 9 p.m. last night. We will proceed to read those comments into the record shortly. In addition, we'll be taking a brief recess before the final public comment period today to gather and again read all comments received after 9 p.m. and during the meeting for the final public comment period. All comments will be posted in their entirety following the meeting. So with that, we will now begin reading public comment into the record for the first public comment period. Ms. Bonner.
For the record, Tiana Bonner, the Public Information Officer of the CCB. The first public comment is from Cody Krakicki. New licenses, this should be discussed. We all deserve a piece of the industry. The next public comment from Mitchell Stipp. This email and attachments pertain to subsection 1 of Article 7, Section C of the CCB agenda, published for the meeting on July 21st, 2020. My firm represents Nuveta LLC. Nuveta filed a complaint against CW Nevada on March 21st, 2019 for breach of its joint venture agreements. The matter was stayed after CW Nevada filed a Chapter 11 bankruptcy petition, and a receiver was subsequently appointed after the petition was dismissed. The parties have agreed to lift the stay against litigation. The receiver through CW Nevada seeks enforcement of the joint venture between Nuveta and CW Nevada. Nuveta has opposed the settlement with CW Nevada because of this effort by the receiver. CW Nevada is not capable of curing its defaults and performing in light of the receivership and settlement with the state. Nuveta filed a motion for a preliminary injunction before Department 1, which would prohibit the consummation of the settlement. For this reason, the matter before CCB should be continued at minimum until after the hearing in Department 1 considers the relief requested by Nuveta. The hearing is on August 13th, 2020. If CCB wants to consider the settlement, notwithstanding the pending preliminary injunction hearing, Nuveta would ask the matter be removed from the consent agenda. If CCB intends to hear the matter as scheduled, Nuveta believes the settlement should be rejected unless the following concerns are addressed. Number one, the licenses which are being revoked should be related to the alleged violation asserted by the state in the complaint. CW Nevada has offered revocation of licenses which have the least value to the estate. Value to the estate should not be the consideration. The relevant consideration is the conduct of Brian Paget and his employees and representatives through CW Nevada. CW Nevada is still owned by Brian Paget. CW Nevada should not be permitted to operate any businesses under any remaining licenses pending their liquidation. The receiver through CW Nevada is operating its dispensary at Blue Diamond. The receiver for CW Nevada also plans to commence operations at Alibaba, Highland, and Oak Ridge after approval is received of the settlement from CCB. Number three, CW Nevada should not be permitted to operate, manage, control, or own any businesses which are regulated by CCB. Overall, the settlement with the state does not accomplish the objectives of holding CW Nevada accountable. Mr. Paget still owns CW Nevada. If the settlement is approved by CCB, CW Nevada will be permitted still to operate, manage, control, or own businesses which are regulated by CCB. And that's 3 minutes for each, so we will move on. Mr. Stipp did include many documents which we will be posting online as well. The next public comment is from Dotan Melik. I am the court-appointed receiver over CW Nevada pursuant to NRS 32.010 and write this letter in support of the stipulation and order for settlement of disciplinary action involving CW Nevada in the Marijuana Enforcement Division of the Department of Taxation, case number 2020-4. I firmly believe that the disciplinary settlement strikes the proper balance to meet the department's interests in regulating Nevada's cannabis industry and the balance to meet the department's interest in regulating and the concerns of the 8th Judicial District Court of Clark County, Nevada, to provide some compensable remedy to those wronged by the pre-receivership management of CW Nevada, including the citizens of Clark County and Nye County, as well as certain businesses and individuals from out of state who were excited to venture into Nevada's new cannabis industry. The disciplinary settlement significantly punishes CW Nevada by revoking 6 of its licenses and certificates and imposing civil penalties in the amount of $1.25 million. The 6 licenses and certificates being revoked can be roughly valued from approximately $4.5 million to $6.75 million. It's my understanding that civil penalties in the amount of $1.25 million would be the highest civil penalties imposed in the history of Nevada's cannabis industry. CW Nevada was already punished by way of the district court, appointing me as the receiver over the company more than a year ago on June 13, 2019. Receivers are typically appointed to take control over distressed and mismanaged companies. The appointment of a receiver is a harsh and extreme remedy to be used against a company sparingly and only when the securing of ultimate justice requires it. As a result of my appointment, CW Nevada's pre-receivership management was displaced, and I was ordered by the district court to preserve and, if possible, maximize the value of CW's assets for the benefit of and distribution to CW Nevada's creditors, which include the department, the Nevada Labor Commissioner, the former employee of CW Nevada, and the landlords of CW Nevada's facilities, among others. CW Nevada is being forced to liquidate its assets, including its licenses, certificates, to pay its debt, and will be facing dissolution upon the conclusion of my receivership. The disciplinary settlement will allow CW Nevada to pay its outstanding taxes to the department in the amount of approximately $1.5 million, civil penalties to the department in the amount of $1.25 million, and unpaid wages to CW Nevada's former employees in the amount of approximately $300,000. These sums are extremely important to Nevada and its citizens, given the state's budget deficit. The next public comment is from Craig Slater. Please be advised that I represent approximately 60 former employees of CW Nevada. Each of my clients is owed wages from CW from their employment with CW. Many of my clients submitted statements in support of the proposed disciplinary resolution. This is intended to offer support for the proposed resolution. Most of my clients were working for CW Nevada, making somewhere between $12 an hour to $18 an hour. Not surprisingly, my clients relied on income from CW Nevada to pay their rent, support their families, pay car payments, and other utilities. CW Nevada's failure to pay my clients the wages due and owing wreaked havoc on my clients. Many of my clients fell behind in their bills and have yet to fully recover from the devastation. To make matters worse, many of my clients continue to work for CW Nevada for several months, believing that was the only way they would get paid was to continue working. My clients unequivocally support the proposed resolution because it offers the only chance to recover the wages that my clients are owed. The wages that are owed to my clients relate to hours my clients worked in the spring of 2019. My clients have waited more than a year, and it finally appears that they are close to recovering their past due wages. However, this only occurs if the proposed settlement is approved. In light of the foregoing, I request that you approve the proposed settlement so that my clients may recover the wages that they are owed. The next public comment is from Will Adler on behalf of Scientists for Consumer Safety. It is understandable and appreciated that the CCB does not hold their meetings in public while the COVID-19 crisis continues. With that in mind, the inability to physically gather in one room does not prevent the inclusion of public, patient, and industry voices and adherence to NRS 241.020, the Nevada Open Meeting Law, through telephonic and video conferencing capabilities. The Attorney General's Open Meeting Law Manual, Section 8.04, states the OML now requires multiple periods of public comment, either before an action are heard by the public body and later before adjournment, or multiple periods of public comment after discussion of each action item but before action is taken on them. It's not possible to comply with OML if all comment is required the day before the meeting. The CCB possesses access to both of these remote participation tools. To continue not to use these capabilities when almost every other public body has chosen to do so, as the Nevada legislature demonstrated over the past 2 weeks, sends a clear message that public participation is not welcomed and creates grave concern that the input being provided in written form is disregarded. Conversely, the opportunity for the public to participate through public comment creates a climate of transparency and trust as it provides useful information to this newly created board regulating a developing industry. I urge the board to not let a desire to finish the process quickly undermine the public's trust in the CCB's ability to govern Nevada's cannabis industry effectively and with transparency. And this next public comment from Mitchell Stipp, but about a different topic. Nevada opposes the settlement between CW Nevada and the state. However, if CCB approves, then it should be a condition that CW Nevada and its receiver shall not be permitted to own or operate any cannabis business, except as permitted by the state to liquidate the remaining licenses of CW Nevada. Attached is the motion filed by the receiver for CW Nevada. There's a hearing scheduled for July 23rd, 2020 at 11:45 a.m. on the receiver's request to reimpose the litigation stay previously lifted by the court. The receiver expressly acknowledged Nevada's right to object to the settlement before the CCB. If Nevada understands the settlement with the state accurately the revocation of certain licenses and the required liquidation of the remainder of CW Nevada's licenses was intended to prevent CW Nevada, its stakeholders, including Brian Paget and the receiver, from operating CW Nevada's cannabis business. However, the settlement does not prevent CW from Nevada from owning or operating other cannabis businesses. An approval by CCB or any settlement with the state should expressly prohibit CW Nevada and its receiver from owning or operating any cannabis business except those under the remaining licenses of CW Nevada's pending liquidation. And he follows it up with several supporting documents. Let's see. The next public comment is from Will Adler on behalf of N2 Packaging Systems, LLC. I'm reaching out to you on behalf of N2 Packaging, LLC, a cannabis packaging company that already operates in over 20 different state cannabis markets. N2 Packaging has previously entered the Nevada marketplace, but was unable to continue its operations as there needed to be some additional clarity provided to the Marijuana Enforcement Division about N2 Packaging and their process. Specifically, the MED expressed concern over N2 Packaging's process and how it reduced oxygen packaging environment might interact with cannabis and cannabis products. Additional conversations were undertaken with MED, now the Cannabis Compliance Board. N2 Packaging wishes to work in Nevada, but is currently unable to as Nevada is now requiring a HACCP plan for oxygen depleted packaging, but does not allow for a third-party group to submit a plan. This is all the more distressing as the ingredients being processed by N2 Packaging, dry cannabis products, should qualify for the exclusions from the definition of potentially hazardous cannabis products and ingredients presented in 1.155 subsection 3. Therefore, it should not be necessary for a company to have to submit an HACC plan when they are using a reduced oxygen processing method to package cultivated marijuana products. N2 Packaging agrees that the cannabis production products, especially those using food additives and ingredients, may need HACCP plans, but it would be unnecessary in cases where a dried cultivated products are packaged in a reduced oxygen environment. N2 Packaging has presented this argument and accompanying scientific studies to the CCB, but has yet to hear any reasoning for HACC plans when packaging cultivated products. Nevada does not currently accept water activity scores, thereby not allowing a packager to prove that a potential for contamination does not exist. If HACC plans must be used in Nevada, please also allow for companies to submit water activity scores and other currently unreported metrics to the staff of the CCB to allow companies to prove their ability to opt out of the now required HACCP plan. This next public comment is from Rihanna Durrett on behalf of the Nevada Dispensary Association. Thank you for continuing to review comments related to the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Regulations and CCR submitted by the cannabis industry and stakeholders. The Nevada Dispensary Association recognizes the efforts the Cannabis Compliance Board has made to consider industry comments and concerns and address such. One particularly complex issue that NDA and members have previously raised and now ask for further consideration is how to vet owners with less than 5% interest. NDA members that have expressed concerns with vetting of owners with less than 5% interest are not requesting less oversight of their companies than authorized in Assembly Bill AB 533. Rather, NDA members are requesting rules that provide a clear path for compliance. As such, please consider the following comments and suggestions. Privately held companies. The proposed revised changes in NCCR 5.112 and 5.125 apply to publicly traded companies. However, the underlying reasons for the changes to these sections also concern some privately held companies as some are partly owned by private equity firms that may have had hundreds of owners with small percentages of ownership interest. Please extend the new language that recognizes the infeasibility of requiring agent cards and approval of transfers for owners with less than 5% on a rolling basis to privately held companies. Waivers. Please allow the subject licensed cannabis establishment to apply for waivers under NCCR 5.112 and 5.125 on behalf of owners with less than 5% interest. Please state that the cannabis establishment must make a, quote, reasonable effort, end quote, to provide the identification and address of each owner rather than requiring the identification and address of all such owners, which would be unreasonably impractical and even impossible in some situations. Please provide the board authority to grant the approval on a continuous or indefinite basis, as the board has authority under the proposed NCCR to withdraw this approval. Alternately, please specify that the CCB's approval of a waiver is valid for at least 1 year unless a different time period is specified. Alternatively, please specify that the waiver submitted by the cannabis establishment extends to their owners with less than 5% interest, and those individuals are not required to submit their own waivers. Disclosure and time period for compliance. Please specify a time period in which a cannabis establishment must disclose and updates its ownerships in order to determine when it must apply for approval of transfer and agent cards. This next public comment was submitted by Dr. Tung. Let me turn sideways. 2 comments based on the text posted as of July 18th, 2020. Number 1, 11.040.9, a testing facility. Please modify the text to notify the appropriate board agent in writing within 2 business days. Justification. As currently written, the regulation in effect demands testing facilities to operate 24/7. The 2 business days reporting period allows time for verification and still serves the desired purpose of immediate notification. Number 2, 11.070, subsection 1, subsection D. The cannabis testing facility shall ensure the seed to sale identification tag is affixed to the sample package. Please modify the text to eliminate the batch, lot, or production run number and the justification. The information of batch, lot, or production number is embedded in the seed to sale identification tag, and the tag is already affixed to the sample package. Additionally, the sample package has limited, often insufficient space for writing after the seed to sale identification tag and security tape being affixed to it. This next public comment is from Mona Lisa Samuelson. Let's see. As the voice of medical cannabis patients in Nevada, I've taken every opportunity to appeal to the various regulators and our legislators in order to create a better understanding for our poorest and most vulnerable consumers. But every plea for help continues to go ignored because the Nevada Dispensary Association is, quote, unwilling to work on anything that may affect the current profit margins of our clientele, end quote. And that means medical cannabis patients still remain at serious risk as far as our consumer safety is concerned. Furthermore, patients still do not have access to any of the basic cannabis products medicinal use requires, nor do we have any regulations that would allow the sick and injured to commercially obtain the live plants and seeds they desperately need in order to get better. Without mincing words, I want to make it clear that both the Department of Public and Behavioral Health, as well as Nevada's tax department, have been given the directive to allow the marijuana industry carte blanche in regulating itself. That forced our state's suffering medical patients to have to beg for legislative protection because Nevada's regulatory policy for cannabis testing standards has also completely failed us. As you know, NRC 67B.786 has yet to be published, and patients suspect it means that it's not being procedurally implemented yet either. Patients have had to lobby for themselves all these years because the industry from the beginning has been given all the legislative power to set things up, and they've done so entirely to the detriment of Nevada's most vulnerable medical patients, period, end of story. Are we now to believe that there will be any fundamental change with the introduction of Nevada's compliance board? The answer to that is quite obviously no, because the same old political games are still being employed. That's right. I'm referring to Senator Harris's written testimony to the CCB's last workshop, in which she submitted input on behalf of the Nevada Dispensary Association. The fact-seated senator has been encouraged by the industry lobbyists to open her own boutique legal firm to proudly advertise her company's unique ability in, quote, getting results for our clients before executive agencies and licensing bodies, end quote. Definitely speaks to everything that's gone wrong for the medical cannabis patients in Nevada. Political collusion between lawyers acting on behalf of well-moneyed and mostly out-of-state investors has already cost the honest citizens of Nevada far more than they'll ever be able to comprehend. But when our regulators blatantly ignore all legal responsibility to consumer safety in favor of these big business dealings, it should be duly noted on public record for everyone to see. This next public comment is from John Marshall. Proposed change to Regulation 13.020 subsection 4 and 5 looks to extend a distributor's possession time from 24 to 48 hours. 13.020 subsection 5, a cannabis distributor shall not store cannabis or cannabis products for more than 48 hours without written consent from the appropriate board agent. Previously, under the adopted regs 92-17, a distributor could hold product for up to 72 hours. I would like to propose that the CCB sticks to the 72-hour possession time period. For those of us transporting product to remote locations from Vegas, Wendover, Ely, Reno, Carson City, etc., it is nearly impossible to make the trip and distribute product in such a short amount of time, and we request that the original 72-hour limitation remain in place. For example, Monday, product pickup from numerous vendors in Vegas, return to hub with partial load evening storage. Tuesday, product pickup from numerous vendors in Vegas, return to hub with partial load evening storage. Wednesday, travel to Reno, Carson City, Wendover, Ely with full load, Monday and Tuesday's pickups. Store in remote hub for evening upon arrival. Thursday, deliver to numerous dispensaries within that jurisdiction. We would like to propose something like the following. The department shall confirm that a notice of temporary storage under NAC 453D.863 subsection 3 is only required when a distributor may unilaterally use its storage area for the temporary storage of marijuana or marijuana products for up to 3 days, and that the marijuana distributor only needs to submit a notice of temporary storage when it plans to use its storage area for the temporary storage of marijuana or marijuana products for more than 3 days. See. The next comment is from John Marshall, again, but relating to something different. Proposed change to 12.035, cannabis product manufacturing facility, required labeling of cannabis products before sale to retail store. We've been in discussion with the department about what has to be on physical packaging versus on the label affixed to package. The majority of products sold in dispensaries are sold in generic containers, glass jars, white plastic tubes, black tubes, opaque plastic bags, plastic boxes. It is nearly impossible to print directly onto these packaging types. We're requesting that the CCB allow manufacturers to put all pertinent information, including warnings, license info, net weights, potency, etc., on labeling affixed to packaging rather than on the packaging itself. There seems to be some confusion on this point, as several of our recent packaging submittals have been rejected for not having direct print on our box, bag, tube, tub. However, 90% of the product in our store has all of this information on labels affixed to packaging, not directly on the packaging itself. This next public comment is from Dr. O, looks like Ali Omar. More licenses equals more dispensaries equals more weed being grown equals cheaper prices for everyone equals volume revenue equals tax income equals better outcome for Nevada. It should matter who you know in order to get a license. We need to freely license anybody like Oregon or Colorado. Allow the free market to decide price and who survives. This is kind of like how this capitalism thing is supposed to work. It appears the dispensaries want to operate full cartel style and sued the state when the legally mandated license expansion period came up. They don't seem to want competition, and we still don't have license expansion yet. Claiming the process was, quote, unfair and rigged, so they could delay competition and keep up the price gouging. Nice try on trying to blame the tourists for this problem. The dispensaries only have themselves to blame. And when the tourists dried up due to COVID, no locals ran down to buy their fungal mold failed product because locals already know who grows mold and who is worth the money. I guess my question is, when will licensing be freely available to the public and not purely based on nepotism? The laws need to change. And this is the last public comment for now. This is from Joshua Hicks, and Laura Jacobson. Yes. We right now to submit additional written comments with respect to the proposed Nevada cannabis compliance regulations published by the Cannabis Compliance Board in advance of the July 21st, 2020 CCB public hearing. These comments are submitted with a reservation of rights to submit further additional or different comments with respect to the proposed or adopted NCCR. We welcome the opportunity to provide further information or clarification that the board may request. NCCR 4.140 Declaratory Orders and Advisory Opinions. We are grateful that the board has proposed this regulation, providing an avenue for licensees to seek a declaratory ruling or an advisory opinion. Per the regulation, declaratory orders are reserved for when the ruling would be significant to the regulation of cannabis and may involve the board's construction of statute or regulation. Consistent with the importance of any such ruling, the board is empowered to set the matter for a hearing and/or solicit additional briefing prior to issuing its ruling. But contrary to the importance of any such ruling that may affect the entire industry, the petitioner is prohibited from obtaining judicial review of any declaratory order. Respectfully, industry-wide issues that involve the construction of regulations, statutes, and Nevada policy are precisely those issues that are most deserving of judicial review. Otherwise, the only option for any licensee to obtain judicial review of a legitimate disagreement regarding the interpretation of a regulation is to violate the regulation and undertake a disciplinary proceeding which provides for eventual judicial review of a board decision as interpreted by the board's advisory opinion and proceed through a disciplinary proceeding for which a petition for judicial review may follow. While the declaratory order procedure could circumvent such disciplinary issues, that purpose is frustrated when judicial review is not permitted. While we appreciate the board's desire to serve as a final arbiter With respect to Nevada's cannabis law, we note that the board's interpretation of NRS chapters 678A through NRS 678D and the NCCR would likely be entitled to great deference under Nevada law. In light of the deference the board would enjoy in a court proceeding, we respectfully request that the board consider allowing declaratory orders of industry-wide importance to be submitted for a court's review. Similarly, we respectfully request that the court consider adopting a procedure pursuant
Great, thank you. Now, Chair, members of the board, we did receive a few additional comments on the regulations up for adoption later today prior to this meeting. While our notice of adoption set a deadline for comments on regulations of 9 a.m. the day before the meeting, we did receive several comments after the deadline. I will be reading all comments received both before and after the deadline to ensure the board is apprised of all public comment. They are as following. From Michael Cristalli, Dear Cannabis Compliance Board, 5.112 addresses publicly traded companies, but there is a distinction between publicly traded companies and public companies. Any offering over 500 is a public offering. For example, Regulation D, Regulation A1 and 2 offerings. The provision should cover all public companies, not just publicly traded companies. Second received from Kimberly Max and Rushton. Dear Chair Douglas, please accept this correspondence on behalf of RAD Source Technologies in response to the recent addition of Cannabis Compliance Board Regulation 12.065 to the proposed draft regulations. For over 20 years, RAD has been the industry leader in manufacturing renewable, non-isotope ionizing radiation products utilized in various applications worldwide. Specific to the cannabis industry, RAD is the developer of the RS-420 line of X-ray irradiators, which are safe, well-studied, and widely used in decontaminating marijuana. The RS-420 line of equipment also operates within parameters prescribed by the FDA to treat food products and is a safe alternative to gamma source irradiators. Relative to the subject regulation on or about May 29, 2020, the CCB published the initial draft regulations pertaining to Nevada's cannabis industry. Including in the notice was a request that interested parties submit comments to the proposed regulations on or before June 9, 2020. CCB Regulation 12.065 was not included in the initial draft regulations. On June 18, 2020, a regulatory workshop was held whereby the proposed regulations were submitted to members of the CCB in anticipation of the initiation of the CCB's oversight effective July 1st, 2020. Included in the meeting notice were the proposed draft regulations, comments submitted on or before June 9th, and public comments submitted pursuant to Nevada Revised Statute, Chapter 241, Meetings of Local and State Agencies. CCB Regulation 12.065 was not in the draft attached to the June 18th, 2020 Notice of Regulatory Workshop. Thereafter, on or about July 3rd, 2020, the CCB published the further revised final proposed regulations of the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Board, set for consideration and adoption on July 21st, 2020, which now includes proposed CCB Regulation 12.065. This being an entirely new regulation, not subject to prior review, comment, and/or input, RAD respectfully requests that adoption be tabled pending further clarification of the regulatory intent and corresponding nexus to NRS Chapter 678A through D. Notice and hearing requirements are not mere technicalities, but instead they are essential to the adoption of valid rules and regulations. Regulation 12, proposed Regulation 12.065, cannabis treated with radiation. If any cannabis or cannabis product has been treated with radiation at any time, any and all packaging of the irradiated cannabis or cannabis product must include labeling that contains the following statement. Warning, this product contains ingredients that have been treated with irradiation in bold lettering along with the Radura symbol as used by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Nevada defines a regulation as an agency rule, standard, directive, or statement of general applicability which effectuates or interprets law or policy, or describes the organization, procedure, or practice requirements of an agency. Although exempt from NRS 233B, CCB maintains the obligation of ensuring that the applicability and purpose of a regulation relates in some way to the governing statutes and that it be of general applicability. As drafted, proposed regulation 12.065 fails to meet either standard. The statutory requirements specific to labeling cannabis or cannabis products are primarily contained in NRS 678B.520 and 678D.420. Neither statute requires or even discusses the necessity of labeling in the manner suggested in CCB Regulation 12.065, primarily because the warning isn't used in the cannabis industry, but instead is applicable to food and food products as overseen by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. As the CCB is aware, a Nevada court will not hesitate to declare regulation invalid when it exceeds statutory authority of the agency. Moreover, the proposed language is overly broad and inaccurately infers a public safety concern with products treated by irradiation. However, it's been proven that irradiation is beneficial in preventing foodborne illnesses, preservation, control of insects, delay of sprouting, and ripening and sterilization that may be present in untreated products for human consumption, whereas radioactive isotopes pose an environmental and security risk. The regulation is also not of general applicability, but instead specifically targets RAD and its cannabis customers in Nevada. If the regulatory intent is to alert consumers about the products used by cultivators to ensure public safety, then the language must be expanded to include the use of ozone, ultraviolet lights, gamma sources, radio frequency radiation, electromagnetic energy waves, and RF photons. Accordingly, in order for CCB Regulation 12.065 to meet the general applicability requirement, it must apply equally. For the reasons articulated herein, RAD respectfully requests that the proposed Regulation 12.065 be withdrawn from consideration by the ZCB until said concerns have been addressed. At a minimum, RAD requests that the proposed language be modified to remove the term warning, as there is no evidence that irradiation is unsafe. Additionally, to avoid confusion and ensure general applicability, RAD recommends that the regulation specifically describe the multiple ways in which cannabis or cannabis product may be treated with radiation. Third comment comes from Will Adler, representing Scientists for Consumer Safety. This is the third submission of an identical comment or number of comments. Please accept the following summary of the detailed comments that were submitted on June 9th, 2020, and again at the June 18th meeting at which the regulations were presented. SCS is again recommending changes to Section 4, 6, and 11 of the NCCR regulations. Section 11, publication of seed to sale tracking data, change may to shall regarding posting metric data and COAs in NCCR 11.070. The board shall publish in digital format compatible with statistical analysis on their website all certificates of analysis issued to them in the preceding month on the first of each month. Retesting. It is the opinion of SCS that no retest ever invalidates a previously failed quality assurance test and that all test results are valid even if retested differently. Regulation 11.075 should be rewritten to include a new subsection 7. The cannabis testing facility selected to perform the retest shall contact the cannabis cultivation or production facility to arrange the collection of a new sample for testing. Upon arrival at the cultivation or production facility, the cannabis testing facility selected to perform the retest will be shown into the facility and escorted to the lot or batch that they are retesting. The cannabis testing facility selected to perform the retest will sample from the previously failed lot using their full sampling and homogeneity protocols. The cannabis testing facility selected to perform the retest will collect the new sample prior to obtaining the previously retained sample on site. The initially retained sample and the newly collected sample will be packaged in unique packaging and identified respectively. The cannabis testing facility selected to perform the retest will then test the previously retained and the newly collected sample using its standard testing protocols. The board will consider the average score from each test performed to determine whether the sample will be declared safe for sale. If the average score of the 3 tests performed is below the limit for quality assurance tests previously failed, the test will be then declared safe and safe for sale. Proficiency testing in CCR 11.040 subsection 8. Successful participation includes an acceptable score of 85% of analyte that the cannabis testing facility reports to include quantitative results when applicable. An acceptable score of 75% or greater, but less than 85%, will require corrective action, but not a full retesting of the lab's proficiency. Random laboratory assurance checks, 11.085 as presented, should be replaced in its entirety with regulations that create a functional system of random laboratory assurance checks. A functional RLAC shall randomly audit every cannabis lab in the state 4 times per year. Board shall send agents to each laboratory unannounced. Those agents will select at least 5 retained samples of products already submitted to the seed to sale tracking system with final certificates of analysis. With the board investigators present, the cannabis laboratory will run a retest, including all quality assurance and cannabinoid tests on the board selected retained samples of a product. The results of the retest must have 80% of the retest producing results within 20% of the original test result. All quality assurance test results shall be the same as originally
Sir,
submitted
sir,
on the
I
COA.
I need you to slow down, please. I need you to slow down. Thank you.
Sure. The results of the retest must have 80% of the retest producing results within 20% of the original test result. All quality assurance test results shall be the same as originally submitted on the COA. Any laboratory that fails the RLAC audit shall be classified as having submitted intentionally false statements. 2 failed RLACs within 24 months shall qualify as a Category 1 violation and may be accompanied by the revocation of the laboratory's license. Next comment from Jesse Chatsworth, to whom it might concern, the final CCB regulation as of July 1st is a well-rounded document. However, an overall observation needs to be addressed. The regulations addressed in great detail the qualifications, responsibilities, policies, procedures, and conduct requirements directed toward current and prospective licenses. Conspicuously absent are provisions for pertinent qualifications and conduct protocols for board agents who are given such power to perform audits, inspections, and investigations. Disciplinary action is entirely within their control. That is a tremendous amount of latitude for board agents to have. It is public knowledge that licensees and prospective licensees have in the past experienced unjustifiable applications of regulations by state personnel. The CCB regulations, by omission of controls for those enforcing requirements, leave open the possibility for continued such practices. CCB regulations impose national and international standards of operation on licensees. Board agents should also be required to utilize such standards for their operations. Auditors, inspectors, and investigators should be certified to such standards as ISO 19011-2018 and ANSI N45.2.23 and use standardized protocols to ensure objective and professional performance of such activities. Otherwise, there is no transparency or credibility for enforcement activities, especially if board agents' decisions contradict the ISO standards the licensee has been required to be accredited to. And finally, from the Nevada Dispensary Association, on behalf of members of the Nevada Dispensary Association, thank you for considering previously submitted written comments and for considering additional comments submitted following the June 18th, 2020 public workshop. As previously stated, NDA thanks the Cannabis Compliance Board for changes made in response to written comments, including the provisions to petition for a rule change, the provision to petition for a declaratory order, the ramp-up period for changing the word marijuana to cannabis in packages and labels, and consideration of adoption of regulations that will allow curbside delivery to continue going forward. As a result of changes to the proposed Nevada Cannabis Compliance Board regulations, NDA submits the following additional comments. Please remove the added language in CCR 4.060188, stating that non-payment of an invoice for a quality assurance test will be grounds for disciplinary action if this provision references invoices issued by cannabis testing facilities. This is a contractual relationship between a cultivation and testing facility that cannot be predetermined through regulation. For example, upon information and belief, at least one testing facility has been sanctioned for sending invoices for multiple tests when only one test was actually performed. Under the proposed regulation, the cultivation facility could be subject to discipline for refusing to pay the erroneous invoice. Please address how an owner whose interest increases above the 5% threshold requiring an agent card may proceed when that amount may fluctuate. Finally, please revise NCCR 5.1105 to allow for any one person, a person that is legally authorized to bind the company, to sign the relevant form notifying the CCB of a transfer of interest. Thank you very much. Great. So we will move on from public comment into agenda item 2, approval of minutes. I will now pass this over to you, Chair.
We have for review the meeting minutes from the Cannabis Compliant Board Regulatory Workshop that was held June 18th, 2020. To either of the commissioners have any corrections or additions wish to make to the minutes that were provided? If there's no corrections or amendments to those minutes, do I have a recommendation for approval?
Mr. Chair, for the record, Jerry Merritt, I move that we approve the minutes of June 18th, 2020 for the Cannabis Compliant Board Regulatory Workshop.
And likewise, do I have a second?
Mr. Chairman, this is Member Nylander, and I would second that motion.
We do have an audio situation. We're not hearing Mr. Nylander as clearly as we should. If up the audio just a little bit from Carson City, we appreciate that. He did make a.
I'm sorry,
motion
who
for
was
second.
that made the motion?
Mr. Nylander?
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me now?
You're still very low.
So the
Mr.
audio
Chairman,
sounds
it
like it's
appears-
fine online, but it's just in this room, so we'll get this turned up here.
That's great.
Mr. Chairman,
Having
it
a motion,
appears the
having a second, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries. The minutes are approved. At this point, we have introduction, number 3, introductory remarks from the Executive Director. Discussion only.
Great, thank you, Chair. Chairman, members of the board, it is a distinct pleasure today to deliver introductory remarks as the first Executive Director at the first meeting of the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Board in front of the first CCB board members. It would be difficult to try to describe everything that's gone into reaching this point, given the task assigned to this agency and the time frame in which we had to accomplish it. And let me be clear so there's no confusion. We are all, by all accounts, just getting started. The work has just begun. But to that point, I asked you, Chairman, if I could deliver introductory remarks today so that I may go on the record and dedicate today's meeting to the staff of the CCB. The 40 members that make up this team today, the 40 members who have dedicated so much of their time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears to ensuring this agency had the pieces in place to embark on what I believe will be a successful journey. Chair, members of the board, you have here at your service a cohort of self-starters in the most startup-style atmosphere of any state agency I've ever seen. This is a bunch of roll-up-your-sleeves and get-it-done at all costs type characters. Moving mountains is a daily occurrence here at the CCB. Now, we have and will continue to navigate a sea of challenges, but this group has consistently shown that it will rise to meet those challenges on behalf of this state. I can tell you unequivocally that we would not be sitting here having this meeting if it was not for this team's incredible hard work and commitment to our mission. So again, it is my honor to let the record reflect today my sincere appreciation for the work each member of the CCB team, including our legal team from the Attorney General's office, has put in and continues to dedicate on this agency's behalf. To each member of the team, thank you. You should be proud of yourselves, you should be proud of each other. Additionally, Chair, members of the board, I would also like to thank the industry and our licensees for their commitment to the transition to a new regulatory regime in the state. Change is never easy, especially in an industry that moves as quickly as this one does. However, I sincerely believe that this change, establishing the CCB, will be beneficial for everyone. This change will challenge the entirety of the industry to become better at what it does, to take that next step in its development, and that includes those who regulate it. Effective regulation is a partnership, and we look forward to building a stronger partnership with the industry and the public as we continue working to fulfill Governor Sisolak's charge of becoming the gold standard in cannabis oversight. With that, Chair, I'll turn it back to you, answer any questions, or we can move on to the next agenda item.
Any additional questions or discussions of our Executive Director by board members? Hearing none.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Who is speaking?
I was asking if we had any questions or concerns by board members.
And who
Hearing
is
none,
the
we will-
speaking, please? I can't see your name tag.
I was asking if we had any additional questions or concerns or to put forth to our Executive Director. In hearing none, we will move the agenda at this point to item number 4, consideration for adoption of permanent regulations of the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Board, NCCR 1 through 14, for possible action.
In court reporter, that was Chairman Douglas, for the record.
Thank you.
Great. And Chair, members of the board, I did receive, or excuse me, I did read into the record those submissions of comments on the regulations. So happy to revisit any of those that we have as we go through the regulation in CCR 1 through 14 here. To begin, Chair, members of the board, before you for agenda item number 4 is the proposed set of regulations referred to as the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Regulations in CCR 1 through 14 for your consideration for adoption today. This proposed draft represents the entirety of the regulations that the CCB will begin using to regulate the cannabis industry in Nevada. These regulations were drafted using NAC 453A and D, the regulations currently in effect, as a foundation for their construction. Many of these regulations are similar to what the industry is currently regulated under. We released the first draft of the NCCR on May 29th, 2020, kicking off a 12-day informal public input gathering period. During this 12-day period, over 40 comments were received from the public and industry, encompassing over 100 pages of written input. CCB staff, in conjunction with the Attorney General's office, analyzed all input received and performed follow-ups, gathered information, issued briefs, and made a number of changes to the original document as a result. Then on June 18th, 2020, the CCB, including all board members present here today, held a public workshop where we detailed the changes made to the original draft as a result of the initial public input period, and again, received more public and industry input on the new draft. So, Chair, members of the board, before you for consideration for adoption today is the final result of that over 6-week public input process. As you know, the CCB per statute is not required to adhere to the Administrative Procedures Act as it pertains to adopting regulations. Not the 12-day informal public input period, nor the public workshop was required per statute, but it was the will of this board and its direction to us to ensure a public and transparent process throughout, which we believe we accomplished. Now, before the board will consider these regulations, Chairman Douglas, you asked that I briefly go through the regulations in a number of smaller groupings so that the board members may have an opportunity to ask any questions or provide any additional comments. To note first, there were minor changes made recently that the board has before them as supplemental materials. This document is entitled Additional Changes to NCCR 1 through 14 for consideration for adoption at the July 21st, 2020 CCB board meeting, and was made available to the public and sent out to the industry prior to this meeting. Before I go through the regulations, I will turn it back over to you, Chairman Douglas, for any questions or comments on the drafting process from the board.
That's fine.
Great, thank you. So I'll now begin going through the regulations. I have my division leads from the CCB here to answer any questions board members may have as well. We'll start with regulations 1 through 3. This includes the title of NCCR, a definitions section, and the Cannabis Compliance Board and the Cannabis Advisory Commission construction. Of note, I would call out the broader definition of person included in Regulation 1, which now allows the CCB to background check not only the individual, but also the entity applying for the license where appropriate. It also clarifies our position that an entity can be issued a work card as an independent contractor to help deal with management contracts. We anticipate management contracts to become more prevalent in the face of a tougher economic climate and the potential for some licensees and operations to look to sell assets or interest. We've had a few requests for facilities to enter into management contracts with another facility as a precursor to a sale or transfer of interest. This clarity in Regulation 1 will allow us to better facilitate those requests. Public input received on these regulations centered around mainly clarifications of definitions, which we were able to accommodate for the most part, as discussed in the public workshop. Chairman Douglas, I'll now turn it over to you for any questions or additional comments from the board on regulations 1 through 3.
Chairman Douglas, as to regulations 1 through 3.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Speak up, please.
Chairman Douglas, as to regulations 1 through 3 for the board. Any questions they wish to ask to our director or members of the staff? Hearing none, we'll move forward.
Great. Moving to regulations 4 and 5, disciplinary actions, other proceedings before the board, licensing and background checks, and registration cards. Chair, members of the board, these two regulations encompass likely the greatest departure and include the most significant changes as compared to the prior regulations. Regulation 4, which deals with disciplinary actions, penalties for violations, and the complaint and hearing process, includes an across-the-board increase to civil penalty amounts. It also includes increased penalty category designations for a number of specific violations. We did receive public input on a way to publicly change or clarify regulations. We agreed with those comments and now provided in Regulation 4 are mechanisms for licensees and applicants to request an advisory opinion from the CCB, along with the ability of any interested person to petition the board for a change in regulations. Regulation 4 also outlines the service of complaint and disciplinary hearing process as prescribed by NRS 678A. Deputy Director Michael Miles will be going through the process for service of complaints per the statute during agenda item 6 as a discussion item later in the meeting. Moving to Regulation 5, this regulation provides a more expansive and comprehensive licensing and approval structure for cannabis companies, owners, and employees, and generally replaces and augments the provisions of NAC 453D250 through NAC 453D.365. Overall, Regulation 5 lays the groundwork for an expansive licensing process. As you know, a main sticking point in prior regulations. It better realizes the vision and policy intent of AB 533 in reiterating that the cannabis industry is indeed a privileged industry. That is, placing the burden on the applicant to prove they are suitable, not placing the burden on the CCB to prove that they are unsuitable. Regulation 5 also clarifies the procedure for waiving the licensing process for non-controlling owners and passive investors who hold less than a 5% ownership stake of the company. Important to note here is that although the board can approve a waiver for a person who holds ownership of less than 5%, the board still has ultimate discretion over that waiver. The board can deny the waiver, rescind the waiver, condition the waiver, and has the authority to ask for any additional information as it deems necessary in carrying out Regulation 5. Additionally, as part of the supplemental document detailing the 5 proposed changes to the draft, we included language that clarifies licensee responsibilities if an entity fails to renew its license, including the surrender of the license if the person or entity fails to renew within 90 days of the expiration date. We did receive feedback regarding clarifications on a number of the sections in Regulation 5 pertaining to waivers and the 5% ownership threshold. Regarding the waiver process, Regulation 5, if adopted, envisions a single waiver form submitted by the company on behalf of all owners with less than 5% interest. But again, subject to board approval and notwithstanding any additional information the board may require. This may include additional forms if necessary, of course, at the board's discretion. Staff will likely recommend waivers to be effective for a period of at least 1 year. But again, Regulation 5, if adopted, would allow for the board's ultimate authority to approve staff recommendations and require more frequent or less frequent waiver submittals for each company and on a case-by-case basis. We received feedback from companies that will likely need to file a waiver if these regulations are adopted in order to be in compliance. That is, they currently have a large number of shareholders holding less than 5% ownership. CCB staff envisions this waiver submittal process from those currently operating with shareholders to take place over a reasonable period of time, understanding that this is a new regulation and requirement for companies. We certainly understand it will take time to compile the necessary information. Policy regarding that timeline to get into compliance will be communicated to the industry through listserv. Ultimately, if this regulation is to be adopted, the timeframe will be reasonable and appropriate per its request. The goal here is not to put some unnecessary burden on those already operating in the industry. They will, of course, need to comply, but there will be appropriate time to do so. Finally, regarding the disclosure of the identification and address of owners with less than 5%, as well as the disclosure and frequency of those owners who may rise above 5% at any given time, CCB staff recognizes the different complexities of shareholder arrangements that exist, including brokerage firm accounts and other passive investor accounts. So while we will expect to have all required ownership information submitted, there will be cases where that information can be harder to ascertain. Again, that discretion for approval in any situation like that, understanding that those situations do exist, that would still come in front of the board to approve or not approve the waiver. Finally, to answer the question on frequency of reporting owners over 5%, CCB annual audits and inspections will begin to require a full reporting of ownership information. So at least annually, but again, may be required more frequently at the request or order of the board. So Chairman Douglas, I'll now turn it back over to you for any questions or additional comments from the board on regulations 4 and 5. I've got our Chief of Investigations and Licensing, Dave Staley, here, can also answer any questions.
Chair Douglas, board members, any concerns or questions as to regulations under 4 and 5 that they wish to put forward at this time?
Mr. Chairman, this is Board Member Nylander in the Carson City location. Can you hear me okay?
We can barely hear you, but we can hear you.
Okay, I just wanted to make a quick comment. With respect to Regulation 5, part of the charge here was to adopt provisions that have worked well within the gaming industry where they were applicable to cannabis. And I think that the regulation does that. Some of the language with respect to suitability and the burden of proof on the applicant is really taken directly from the Nevada Gaming Control Act. And so I just wanted to express my support for the regulation as written.
Thank you. Commissioner Merritt, anything? This is Chair Douglas. Just two brief comments as to this. This is not a document that's going to be set in stone. We realize there's some concerns as of the 5%. We are still examining and looking at how we deal with that issue, the less than 5%. I would also like to pay special attention to proposed change to Regulation 5.095, sub 3, and that is if a person or entity fails to renew its license by the expiration date, then the license shall cease operation until its license is renewed. That comes to us from the NRSs. It basically states that if you are operating a business and you have not filed your renewal, you are to cease operation, otherwise you're in violation of the law. One of the tenets of asking for renewal or asking for additional licenses is that you're in compliance. So we wanted to put that out there so no one is backdoored. You see it up front for those who are not aware of the NRS as to what is going on. So that's a very important notice and change, that until you have submitted your license renewal and the payment, you should not be operating. Once you've done that, then you can go forward and operate because it's deemed technically renewed pending review. So this is a very important carve-out that has been added. That's my only comment. So please proceed.
Great, thank you. Moving on to regulations 6, 7, and 8. Regulation 6 outlines cannabis possession limits for patients and adult use consumers, requirements if establishment has changes in operations, written requests to change locations, standard operating procedures, inventory control systems, outdoor cultivation requirements, cleanliness and health of agents, and restrictions on advertising. Regulation 7 outlines the requirements for cannabis sales facilities, operations, duties of agents before sale to consumer, proof of age, sales limits, restrictions on sales, advertising, storage, sources, and delivery requirements. Regulation 8 outlines the requirements for cannabis cultivation facilities, including operations, samples, excise taxes, access, and storage. Contained in these regulations, we did remove testing facilities from some of the other facility requirements currently in place, as well as clarified and extended other reporting dates that were really unrealistic and overly burdensome. So really just trying to find some efficiencies where we can here. We also included in these regulations various public health and safety measures including placing a duty on cannabis sales facilities to not recommend products to women that are pregnant or breastfeeding. Other than these changes, plus a few more minor changes that we discussed during the workshop, regulations 6 through 8 mainly align with 453 AD regulations on the same subject areas. So, Chair, I'll turn it back to you again for any additional comments from the board on regulations 6, 7, and 8.
Chair Douglas, any additional concerns or questions that they wish to present at this time?
No.
In Carson City?
None, Mr. Chairman.
I would ask if our director or if staff wishes to make any comments as to McDonald Carano representation that was sent in as to subsection 6, 0872B4 and 60851A 6 and 7, whether or not they had a chance to review those, and did they put forth any concerns that we should be looking at?
So, Mr. Chair, this is Executive Director Klimas for the record. At least in 6.085, the suggested change, they are asking us to consider exempting cannabis testing facilities from some of the operations or requirements. We did do some of that in 6 through 8. I think this comment is well received. We understand that testing facilities are very different than some of our other establishments. So we will continue to look at this. I think it's something that will be an ongoing conversations that we can bring up as we realize what really is efficient and what's not efficient in the industry.
In light of that response, anything additional? This is Chair Douglas.
No.
Hearing nothing at this point, we will proceed further.
Great. Moving on to regulations 9 and 10. Regulation 9 outlines the requirements for production facilities, including hand and arm contact with products, qualifications, extraction, training, use of ingredients, sanitation, temperature control, shelf life, testing, sinks, equipment, and ventilation. Regulation 10 outlines the requirements for minimum good manufacturing practices, including quality control, ventilation and filtration, labeling and packaging, standard operating procedures, maintenance of equipment, hygiene, salvage of products, records, building requirements, water, plumbing, lighting, pesticide application, and waste. Again, Regulation 9 and 10, Chair, members of the board, these are closely aligned with the current 453A and D regulations. We did take this opportunity to require that a food protection manager remain at facilities during all hours of operation, and some additional layers of approvals needed for menu item changes before they're submitted to the board for approval. The addition of time requirements for the food protection manager is in line with recommendations of the FDA and the requirements of the local health district. So, Chair, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions or additional comments outside the public workshop on regulations 9 and 10.
Chair Douglas, as to propose 9 and 10, any comments, questions by board members at this time? I see in Carson City shaking her head, and Ms. Merritt silent on the other end.
No comment, sir.
We will move along.
Great. Moving on to Regulation 11. This outlines the requirements for cannabis testing facilities, including qualifications, accreditation, general laboratory standards and practices, chain of custody, records, proficiency testing, research and development, quality assurance, required tests, pesticides, sampling, certificates of analysis, and retesting. As previously discussed in the workshop, we went through a number of changes to Regulation 11. Some minor enhancements But really, the purpose was to address some of the issues we faced recently with lab testing in the state. This is also very much a work in progress for Regulation 11. We received a lot of input on this, and we're certainly looking forward to continuing to work through Regulation 11. It also includes here some opportunities for the board to release information to the public on testing facilities and testing results that was previously not released. And so if these regulations are adopted, there is certainly opportunity for the board to take another step forward in transparency and accountability. So with that, again, having a number of conversations in the public workshop, Chair, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions or additional comments from the board on Regulation 11.
Again, Chair Douglas, any questions or concerns as to Regulation 11 by members of the board?
Mr. Chair, no comments.
And likewise in Carson City?
Mr. Chairman, no comments.
Then we will move along.
Great. Moving to Regulations 12 and 13. Regulation 12 outlines the requirements for packaging and labeling of cannabis products, including stamp or mold requirements, labeling, product disclosures, and warnings. Regulation 13 outlines the requirements for cannabis distributors, including duties of the distributor, storage of cannabis and cannabis products, distribution amounts, and multiple deliveries. Although we mentioned this at the workshop, I will reiterate that the CCB will issue guidance if these regulations are adopted that will allow for a 12-month work-through period for existing packaging that will come as a listserv. This will help with establishments' transition to the new wording for warning requirements. Also stemming from recent feedback, in some that you heard me read into the record here, we did make a change to allow for the storage time for distributors to be increased from 24 to 48 hours. The time frame was analyzed by CCB staff, and we feel that this change is adequate and will provide for more flexibility when traveling long distances within the state. All products stored will need to be documented in the seed to sale tracking system, however. So with that, Chair Douglas, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions or additional comments from the board on Regulations 12 and 13.
Chair Douglas, for the record, as to Regulations 12 and 13, questions by board members?
Mr. Chair, no comments. Jerry Merritt.
As to these two areas, we seem to have gotten, this is Chair Douglas for the record, a lot of chatter in the public comment areas as to some of the items that were within 12 and 13. This has been vetted. It's probably not the end of the vetting as we attempt to improve what we are doing. The only concern I have this date, and it might have been answered by our director, we had gotten a letter from Cooper Levinson as to the notice from RAD, and as to 12.065, they were asking whether we would hold that matter since they were feeling it wasn't properly before us this date because of the change. In light of your opening statement, as to the regulations and our compliance, do you feel we are in compliance, or should we hold at this date and bring that back?
This is Executive Director Klimas for the record. Concerning the comments from Cooper Levinson in regard to RAD Technologies or RAD Source here, basically this comes down to that warning label, which we have proposed in our regulation with the word warning. You know, this is a process that staff has actually worked on, or at least worked to understand over the past 6 to 8 months, maybe even longer, just this process of irradiation. We're obviously taking the position we want to err on the side of caution, understanding that this process is used on other foodstuffs. For a number of months, we did not have really adequate studies that gave us a comfort level with this. Since then, and as recent as the beginning of July, we did receive a safety study from one of our licensees on this process. I think, Chair, members of the board, we still feel comfortable with having some kind of label or notice on a product if it is, considering this is somewhat at least new for our industry. I think in these comments, they said, at the very least, if you did want to keep a label that you didn't use the word warning, I think that's something that we would be open to, whether it be something like notice. Um, Again, as we work through these new technologies, we just want to make sure that we're erring on the side of caution, where we can get more relaxed from a stronger position rather than trying to put more restrictions on. So, I guess what I would say is I don't feel like it needs to be pulled back, if you agree, but I do feel that we can make that change on the word warning and put something along the lines of notice, which I do believe that they asked for in here.
In light of that response, any further discussion by the board as to this item?
Mr. Chairman, this is Member Nylander. Just a quick question for the executive director. So if I'm understanding what you're saying, the word warning would then be interpreted to mean that notice would be sufficient to satisfy the regulation.
Member Nylander, that is correct. So I think staff internally, what is important to us is that consumers just have an understanding of what has been tested and how it's been tested, or how it's been, irradiated in this case.
Understood, and I do support that. I think it's an interpretation of that word. I just wanted to make it clear on the record, because I also don't want the regulations to the extent we can prevent that from sort of hamstringing staff in terms of consumer protection items. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Member Nylander.
Thank you. We will move to our last area, I presume.
Great. Lastly, Regulation 14, which requires cannabis establishments to create and maintain policies and procedures prohibiting discrimination and harassment in the workplace. Now, the original draft of NCCR had regulations 1 through 15, to be clear, but the initial draft's number 14 was removed after discussions with the Department of Public and Behavioral Health. This regulation, the old number 14, if you will, it dealt exclusively with DPPH. And after consulting with their Deputy Attorney General, they felt comfortable that those requirements were contained in their own regulations and that they would prefer to leave them as such. We had no issues with that, but I just wanted to make clear that that is the reason that the original Regulation 14 has been removed. So now, addressing this current Regulation 14, this is, again, to create, maintain policies and procedures prohibiting discrimination and harassment in the workplace. So with that, Chairman, staff is available. I'm available to answer any questions on Regulation 14 or the entirety of NCCR 1 through 14 before you consider adoption.
Thank you. As Chair Douglas, for the record, we've had an overview from our Executive Director of 1 through 14. Additional questions, concerns, comments from our board as to this before we entertain any motions?
Mr. Chairman, this is Member Nylander. Just a quick comment, and I want to echo what you said not only during the workshop but today. These regulations are an evolution, and this has been a very heavy lift to get to this point. And I intend to support the regulations as we've discussed today, but understanding that this is an evolving industry and on some level a very new industry. And so I recognize that we are going to be constantly looking at these regulations and how they're implemented, and we will make the changes as necessary. But I think this is a great step for the state of Nevada to revamp the way this has been regulated in the past. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Commissioner, no comments? Chair Douglas, for the record, I support the comments that were echoed by Commissioner Nylander, that this is an evolution. This law went into effect as of July 1. We were charged with implementing new regulations or piggybacking on the regulations that had been in effect, going through them, taking what worked, discarding what did not. I think at this time, this is a good first step, and I utilize that word first step. We appreciate the comments from the industry and their concerns. We are not turning a deaf ear on some of the suggestions that they raised in the public comments at the workshop or that were provided us this date. This is our first blush of painting by the numbers. We hope that with some additional time, we can do some things that help clarify the areas of concern the industry has put forth, but also not shunning our obligation that was given to us by the legislature to comport within the Nevada revised statutes. I note for the record that some of the statutes that have been provided to us from the legislature create some trepidation on our part as to how we regulate. And one of the biggest concerns we have is the 5% or less rulings because of the underlying requirements of what a licensee has to comport in terms of interest, crimes, child support, a number of things. And at this point, we are not free to just free to not enforce those requirements on those individuals who are 5% or less. But we have to figure out a way to do that because, as was stated, person is very all-encompassing, and publicly traded or public companies create a unique situation for us to look at. And so that's something we are going to be working on in the future and working with the industry as to that. With that, is there a motion for adoption of regulations 1 through 14 as stated, or a motion for adoption of 1 through 14 with any proposed changes or omissions from the board?
Mr. Chairman, this is Member Nylander. I would I would make the motion to adopt regulations 1 through 14 as they're stated in our materials with the changes that are supplemented as, I believe, item number 5, Yeah, it's part
And
of
does
item
that
number 4.
motion that you are putting on the record also contemplate your concerns as to the word warning to notice?
Yes, I'm comfortable with it the way it's worded.
As it's presently worded or with a change? So I understand you completely.
Yeah, my understanding from the executive director is that they are going to include the notion of a notice as opposed to a warning, the actual word warning, as part of the word warning. So I'm comfortable with that.
Thank you. Do I have a second to that?
Mr. Chair, for the record, Jerry Merritt, I second.
We have a motion. It's been second. Any additional discussion? Hearing none. Call for the vote. In favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. All three members have voted in the affirmative. The motion carries. That brings us to item number 5, extended review period of transfer of interest for discussion and possible action.
Great, thank you, Chair, members of the board. For agenda item number 6, you have consideration for possible action to lift the extended review period on transfers of interest. As background, this extended review period on transfers of interest was put into place by the Marijuana Enforcement Division in October of 2019. This action was taken as a result of the then recent reports of potential unsuitable actors trying to gain access to the cannabis industry in Nevada. The action was also in response to the general lack of vetting and background check capabilities afforded to the Marijuana Enforcement Division under its regulations, NAC 453A and D. As a result of the extended review period, the CCB currently has 92 outstanding distinct pending TOI requests. That's transfers of interest. But when you combine the TOI applications by parent companies, it sits at about 55 requests outstanding. Some background on the outstanding requests. Some of the TOIs are simple withdrawals, some internal percent changes with varying complexity, and some are extremely complicated, involving international publicly traded companies or complex organizational structures. Work on preparing to process these transfers has been ongoing, and CCB staff, including our newly revamped investigations division, has performed a number of outreach activities with licensees to continue preparing for when this review period would be lifted. Chairman Douglas, members of the board, if you do take action to lift the extended review period today, processing the outstanding requests, including what we anticipate would be a number of new requests submitted, will take some time. This will likely need to be a phased approach in which the CCB can process more straightforward requests first as we work towards the more complex situations. I can say with confidence that if the board were to vote to lift the extended review period today, that we would have recommendations for the board to consider on many of the TOIs by the next board meeting in August. Potentially upwards of 20% of the outstanding requests could be up for board action then. Regardless of the time it would take, I am confident, especially given the new regulations that were just adopted and the extensive nature of licensing capabilities laid out in newly proposed or newly adopted now Regulation 5, that the CCB will have the necessary tools to vet, investigate, and make appropriate recommendations to the board as to the suitability of individuals and to the nature of various transactions. Given that, it would be my recommendation that the board vote to lift the extended review period today. CCB staff, including our Chief of Investigations, Dave Staley, are available here to answer any questions that the board may have. Chair, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Chair Douglas, for the record, we've heard the report of the Executive Director as to this matter. Additional questions, concerns to be addressed to the Director or staff at this time? Hearing none and the shaking of heads no. If we have a motion for acceptance of list.
Mr. Chairman, this is Member Nylander. I would move that we go ahead and lift those restrictions as requested by the Executive Director and staff, and noting that that as he indicated, there are now capabilities in place with the new regulation to adequately address these transfers that were not there previously, and also the ramping up of investigative staff to be able to adequately determine the suitability of these transfers and the individuals involved. So for those reasons, I would move that we go ahead and lift the restriction.
Thank you. And do I have a second or in?
Jerry Merritt, for the record, second.
We have a motion. We have a second for lifting of the stay. Unless there's any additional discussion, all in favor say aye.
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 Aye. It's been moved and carried. Motion's adopted. We now move to process of service of complaints, and this is on for information and discussion only.
Good morning. This is Michael Miles, Deputy Director. Good morning, Chair and board members. The Executive Director wanted me to give you a brief breakdown of the new disciplinary process. When the Executive Director becomes aware that a licensee agent has violated, is violating, or is about to violate Title 56 of any regulation, He will collect the facts and information of said violation and turn it over to the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office, in conjunction with the CCB agents, will investigate the claims and determine if disciplinary action is warranted. If warranted, the Attorney General's office will prepare a complaint and return it with their recommendations to the Executive Director. The Executive Director will add the approval for service of the complaints to a board meeting agenda as complaint A, B, and so on. At the agendized board meeting, the Executive Director will add a brief summary of the violations alleged in the complaints. To protect any potential due process rights and to comply with NRS 678A, 510, and 520, no facts or names will be discussed, and the board will not see the actual complaint. The only action that will be decided is whether to serve the complaint. After permission to serve is granted, the complaint will be served on the licensee or agent, and then it will be uploaded to the CCB website in full. If the party doesn't wish to dispute the violations and discipline, they can accept the discipline as listed in the complaint, and the board will enter an order imposing that discipline at the next board meeting. If the party chooses to oppose the complaint, the party will have 20 days to answer the complaint with a request for hearing. Once the answer and request for hearing is served on the board will schedule a hearing on the matter within 45 days. The board will decide who hears the matter, but if it is a hearing officer, the hearing officer, after hearing the matter, will submit their findings and recommendations to the board for adjudication. The board can accept the hearings officer's recommendation in whole or in part. In addition, they can choose to let both sides briefly present arguments and then decide on the hearings officer's recommendation. If the licensee or agent is unsuccessful, they can accept the discipline as assessed, or they can file a petition for judicial review with the district court pursuant to NRS 678, 610. Anybody have any questions?
No questions.
Great. Thank you for your time.
That will dispose of that item at this time. That will move us to our consent items, our consent agenda. And we have 3 items I propose as to the consent. We take them each separately as we go through. The first matter is as to A, complaints, which seems appropriate after the process of service of complaints.
Great, thanks, Chair. And I'll just briefly go through A to start. And you just heard from Deputy Director Miles on the process. And so it is laid out. They are listed here as licensee A, B, and C, but for those watching and the public, following the meeting, if these are approved to be served, they will be released in their entirety and made public. So for A, on the consent agenda concerns the service of 3 complaints for disciplinary action pursuant to NRS 678A.510. The Attorney General has reviewed these violations and has recommended proceeding with disciplinary action. I will now present the violations alleged and request the board vote to authorize the service of a complaint for disciplinary action for each of the licensees. As to licensee A and B, complaint.
Director, before, this is Chair Douglas, before you give us generic violations, would you just for the record indicate what 678 5.510 requires in terms of this being shown as complaint against licensee A, B, and C, that the board, where the board is at this time in terms of the Attorney General and the Director?
Sure, and Deputy Director Miles, if you have some insight into that, maybe come up here. But essentially, per the statute, the board is supposed to act in a procedural capacity to issue these complaints. It's laid out in statute. And so by listing these as licensee A, B, and C without going through the licensee name and the actual violations, it remains a procedural action which allows you, and the board is required for the statute to approve the procedural action of issuing the complaint, if that's helpful.
And that's having not been reviewed by the board, but having been reviewed by the Attorney General and the Director, is that correct?
That's correct. Complaints come to me as the executive director. If I feel that they warrant investigation, I transmit those to the Attorney General's office. They do their investigation. If they approve, it comes back to me as the executive director to bring up in a procedural capacity in front of the board as we are sitting here now with licensee A, B, and C.
Exactly. This is just similar to the procedural process of filing it with the clerk and being able to serve the complaint at that point. So you're just giving us permission to serve the complaint.
And then, this is Chair Douglas for the record, and then once these items are approved, then for the first time, the names are inserted as to who the parties actually are.
Correct.
That's correct.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, this
Please
is Member
continue.
Nylander. Could I follow up on your question?
Please.
Yeah, so just looking at the overall process, it seems to me that we ought to at least consider for the next legislative session. I mean, I understand that this is required by statute, but the process seems sort of wonky to me, as much as I don't know why we wouldn't grant the authority to the Attorney General's office to effectuate service of process if a majority of the board members has reviewed the complaint and through the Attorney General's office agrees that service of process should be done. And I know we don't want to do anything under the open meeting law that would be violative, but it seems to me that's a perfunctory process that this board shouldn't necessarily need to do unless the Attorney General's office requests that we do it. But as I understand it, the law requires it right now, which is, well, it's very different from what happens with other government agencies that I'm aware of. So thank you for that time for the comment.
I can actually respond to that real quick if you want. We actually decided to make a correction, if we can, to the legislation to change NRS 678A 510 subsection 2 to say the board, comma, through the executive director, comma, shall promptly make a determination regarding the service of these complaints. So hopefully that will resolve that situation.
Thank you. Mr. Director, please go forward with the generic information.
Great. As to licensees A and B, complaints have already been submitted under the Department of Taxation, but remain pending due to the jurisdiction change from the Department of Taxation to the Cannabis Compliance Board on July 1st, 2020. The board will need to approve service of complaints so that the board can set hearings and adjudicate them. As to licensee A, the complaint will allege violations of the following regulations: NAC 453D.905 3B9, NAC 453D.905 3D8. As to licensee B, the complaint will allege violations of the following statutes and regulations: NRS 453A.340, NAC 453D.312, NAC 453D.400, NAC 453.434, NAC 453D.438, NAC 453D.446, NAC 453D.708, 453D.720, NAC 453D.732, NAC 453D.734, 453D.740, 453.805, and 16 violations of NAC 453D.905. As to licensee C, the complaint will allege violations of the following regulations: 2 violations of NAC 453D.905 3B8. And so, Chair, those are the 3 complaints. I think you want to go through each consent agenda item separately, so I will turn it back to you.
Chair Douglas, for the record, we've heard the representations from our executive director as complaints under A, 1, 2, and 3, approval of service of complaints. We have a motion to accept in whole or in part going forward with the service of process.
Mr. Chairman, this
Mr.
is
Chair,
Board
for
Member
the record,
Nylander.
Jerry Merritt, motion to accept.
We have a motion,
I would second the motion.
and we have a second motion by Board Member Merritt. With that, and second by Nylander. No additional discussion need to be had in light of the legal status of this by the board. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. Motion carries. Moving to administrative matter B, approval of Cannabis Compliance Board forms for possible action. This matter is on because we've now passed regulations. Director?
That's correct. Thank you. So this will be kind of an ongoing project as we do update forms, and for clarity in the regulations, there are many instances where licensees will submit information on a form prescribed by the board. So the 13 forms that you see here are forms that correspond with the proposed and now adopted regulations in CCR 1 through 14. They consist a lot of updates to current forms, and some new forms to align with the new requirements as a result of the regulations. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Chair.
This matter, Chair Douglas, this matter was on for consent as to forms, board forms, compliance board forms. If we have a motion to accept this consent item.
Mr. President, for the record, Mr. Chair, for the record, Jerry Merritt, I motion to approve the Cannabis Compliant Board forms.
Do we have a second?
Mr. Chairman, this is Member Nylander. I would second the motion.
We have a motion, we have a second. No additional discussion as to this matter. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. Motion's been carried, all three approve. As to the third item, the C item, that is for approval of recommendation, stipulation, order of settlement of disciplinary action. Before we go any further on that, I understand Commissioner Nylander has a representation for the record.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a disclosure and I intend to abstain on this item. I am of counsel with the law firm Kemper Kroll. I do not have a pecuniary interest in the law firm and knew nothing about this matter until I read the complaint. But that law firm has apparently represented one of these companies in the past. And although I have never had a marijuana client because I deal exclusively in the gaming industry, and the gaming industry is prohibited from having any involvement in the cannabis industry. So I don't, have any knowledge of it, but in order to avoid any appearance of impropriety, and being this is our first meeting, I certainly want this thing to be clean. And so for those reasons, and the fact that and again, I would state I don't have any pecuniary interest in any of this. My arrangement with that law firm is that we just basically share office space, but I think out of an abundance of caution, I'm going to go ahead and abstain on this matter. So I would ask if the Deputy Attorney General, if that's an adequate disclosure.
This is Deputy Balla for the record, Member Nylander. That is a sufficient disclosure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I
Chair
will go
Douglas,
ahead
for the record, with that
abstain on
representation.
this matter, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. For purposes of this meeting, we understand that for quorum purposes, Commissioner Donovan is still counted. However, for purposes of any action, the two remaining commissioners are sufficient to take action this day. Is that my understanding from our council?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
We have on for approval of the recommended stipulation and order for settlement of disciplinary action regarding CW Nevada LLC, C009, RC009, C010, P009, RP009, C011, RC011, D010, RD010, T021, and T022 for possible action at this time. Representation from council.
Good morning, Chair Douglas, Board Member Merritt, Board Member Nylander. My name is Ashley Balducci, and I am a Senior Deputy Attorney General with the Office of the Nevada Attorney General. Before answering any questions you may have on the stipulation and order for settlement of disciplinary action against CW Nevada LLC, I would like to put on the record that on 11:47 p.m. last night, I received an ex-parte application for temporary restraining order and motion for preliminary injunction on OST against the Department of Taxation filed by an entity named CW Nevada Majority Shareholders LLC. This entity is not licensed or regulated by this board. If the board would like a copy and an opportunity to review, I am happy to oblige. If the board has any questions about the stipulation and order for settlement of disciplinary action, I can answer now.
Chair Douglas, for the record, we received copies of some information that's put in place to the CC board, reference the underlying lawsuit that, to my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, where the court has approved a good faith settlement as to this matter, subject to our taking a position, and then a brand new lawsuit that has been brought by this group that you're talking about. We likewise received papers from the receiver and the attorney for the secondary group, one asking us to hold the action, the other wishing us to go forward to resolve this. Under the circumstance, recommendation or feeling from you as to this matter?
Well, I would recommend that the board take action. CW Majority Shareholders LLC is not licensed or regulated by this board, and the other litigation is between two different licensees. And so I would ask that the board vote on the action.
Thank you. Commissioner Merritt, any additional questions you have of council?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Chair.
Any questions or concerns that you wish to voice or have answered by council?
Sir, not at this time.
Right. Then as of this matter, we have the ability for possible action this date. It's kind of dubious with only two. However, I would move that we accept the order for settlement that has been provided to us this date as to the underlying action that the parties have litigated and the court has approved the good faith settlement within. Understanding there's other litigation, but that can proceed. This does not, from our standpoint, affect our view of the litigation that has, for the most part, concluded.
And Chair, just so you know, the parties who objected also had an opportunity in the receivership court to object at that time as well.
I understand that, and what they were asking for us to do is to, Chair Douglas, for the record, to hold this until they have their hearing. This matter has been delayed long enough. I think we need to state on the record whether we approve or disapprove. My motion's for approval. Do we have a second to that?
Chair Romero, for the record, second.
We have a motion and a second, unless there's any further discussion among the two of us and council. How do you vote?
Again, please. I did not hear you.
I asked to approve us accepting the order of settlement of the disciplinary.
Okay, and then of course, after the second, you're just asking us for aye. Okay, aye.
And I likewise would approve the acceptance. And
Thank
we
you, sir.
understand that this does not end the whole process. There's just still some other matters that will come back before this board and some other matters that go into court, but those other matters do not concern us at this time.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Board Member Merritt. Thank you, Executive Director.
I note the next item on our agenda is a meeting date, our next board meeting of August 25th, 2020. And at this point, it seems like a great place to take a break so we can come back and if we have items for future agenda or other public comment that needs to be read in the record, it can be read in the record. And that gives everybody a chance to stretch and take a break.
Great.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just doing a sound check.
Member Nylander, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, a lot better than we have been the whole meeting. So it's really great to hear your voice.
Yeah, you as well.
All right, we
Yeah.
Are we live, James? I think one more minute and then we're live.
okay, we are back on the record. This is Chair Douglas for the record. We had ended with the statement of our next date, and that next date is the next regularly scheduled board meeting of the CCB, which is August 25th, 2020. Item 9 is items for future agenda for discussion only. I apologize for my poor note-taking. Commissioner Nylander, you had mentioned one thing that you wanted to see on a future agenda during our earlier remarks. Do you recall what that was at this point?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll just recap this notion of service of process. That I think that's something we can put in our next legislative package down the road, and maybe for discussion, further discussion, since I just raised it. But it seems to me it's a perfunctory matter that the board shouldn't have to act on, and I'm comfortable with the AG's office and the staff doing the service of process. So just working through a better way to do that.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Merritt, anything that you would like to see moving forward?
Again, I didn't hear you.
This is Chair Douglas, in terms of items for future agendas. Did you have any item that you wanted to put forth at this date? For the record, Chair Douglas, I have one item which goes back to the concern in terms of license renewals, to get an update from our director in terms of how many licensees we have that are out of compliance at this time with the renewal notices. Since I understand we have about 700, to see what our minor number hopefully is going forward. With that, from the director, any items that he has that he's going to be bringing forward?
Chair, thank you. The only thing that I would add, and I think it'll be ongoing for the next, well, probably in perpetuity, but will be the transfers of interest. So not only will we have some on the agenda item, but we can have further discussions on about, timelines and timeframes for that. So the industry has clarity, and so does the board.
Thank you. That then moves us to item number 10, public comment, our second round.
For the record, Tiana Bonner, the PIO for the CCB. We have two more public comments that have come in. One from Jennifer Gallerani. She's simply seeking that we verify that the CCB has received a formal application from Blackbird Logistics to nominate their CEO for a position with CCB as an industry representative. And the second public comment from Dale Walsh. He says, I see by reading the final proposed regulations that my comment was mostly ignored. It was read into the record during the June 18th workshop, but I didn't see it in the list of comments that came out after that. I guess you put clearly in front of detectable in section 8.015 subsection 3B. That does nothing to change the fact that the part of the regulation that addresses odor remains subjective and open to interpretation and potential disagreements over what the regulation means. One person's strong odor and clearly detectable can be very different from another's. When asked in the future why the odor portion of the Nevada regulations, except the city of Las Vegas, is so hard to enforce, I will say I told them they needed to make it objective with the measurable criteria, but they didn't listen. They didn't seem to care about the odor issue. And so he also attached what he did send for that June 18th public workshop, which will be posted online.
Thank you.
Chair Douglas, that would end our additional public comment that was received for this meeting this date. The last item on is for adjournment. As I indicated, our next meeting is August 25th, 2020, regularly scheduled. Do I have a motion for adjournment?
Jerry Merritt, motion to adjourn.
We have a motion. And I
Mr.
presume we have
Chairman,
a second. We are adjourned.